Hi, everybody, and welcome to this panel. This panel is on media consumption and the pandemic. So this is part of a CRS web-based project, and we're specifically focusing on COVID-19 and various different issues in the Middle East and the Gulf. So I'm Susie Morgani, and I'm Assistant Director for Publications at CRS. That's the Center for International and Regional Studies, Georgetown University in Qatar. So today our guests on the panel are going to be Professors Banu Akdenizli and Professor Joe Khalil. So just to give you a little bit of a background, Banu Akdenizli is an Associate Professor of Communications at Northwestern University in Qatar. Her research is in international and political communication, public diplomacy, and media in the Middle East and Turkey. Among her publications are Digital Transformations in Turkey and Democracy in the Age of New Media. Joe Khalil is also an Associate Professor of Global Media and Communication at Northwestern University. His research interests are in global television content production, regional television industry, and alternative media. Among his publications are Arab Satellite Entertainment Television and Public Diplomacy, and the forthcoming Handbook of Media and Culture in the Middle East. Welcome to you both, Banu and Joe.
Thank you for having us.
You're welcome. Banu, my first question is for you. So it's something that we've all been experiencing recently since the start of the pandemic, and that's a serious increase in the time spent on our digital devices. So can you just give us a general idea of how digital media is being used currently?
Of course. When we look into the patterns, and as I mentioned, when I'm talking about patterns, I'm trying to keep it as much as global as possible, because over the couple of past weeks, we see a lot of research organizations and companies collecting data about the digital, not only digital media, but general media use during COVID-19. And what we see are two particular trends. People, yes, are consuming more media, that's for sure, because these are uncertain times. And when there is uncertain times, we feel the need to, reach out for more information. So one pattern we see is the consumption of media for information. But as we said, these are also uncertain times, and uncertain times and we're social beings, so we need to reach out to our communities. So another thing we see is media consumption for entertainment. There is a recent study that was published by the Global Web Index. So allow me to share with you some statistics. So this is a shorter kind of study in the sense that only 4,000 people, internet users across the United States and UK, were surveyed, and we see that especially when it comes to quarantine, what they deem as quarantine internet activities, we see, for example, 68% of these internet users looking for COVID-19 news specifically. 58% are looking for music or listening to music. 98 are watching movies and shows. 42 are looking for funny videos. And there are also 40% playing games on mobile. And they did like a distinction between generations as well. I mean, the only generation that's listening to more music or watching more, videos and playing games online is what we would call the Generation Z, the 16 to 23-year-old, and which, kind of makes sense. So I still have a lot of numbers that I could share. One thing, another important organization that does these yearly reports on trust is the Edelman Trust Barometer. And they just published a spring update specifically to COVID-19. And again, people are looking for reliable information, and that has actually kind of driven the trust in news sources to an all-time high. And interestingly here, not only in digital media, but traditional media as well. For example, in January 2020, traditional media was at 62. In May 2020, it is at 69. And there's strong demand for expert voice, doctors, scientists, and information from national health officials. So I'm going to leave it at that to, provide you a little snapshot.
Thank you. Thank you for giving us that great overview of what's happening in digital media. So turning to you now, Joe, what are some of the challenges of global media in the current context of COVID-19?
Yeah, I mean, what a year, and we're barely halfway. I'll focus on television and streaming because this is the year for it, basically. This is where the main action is. And I think, broadly speaking, we have three main areas. The first one is in the area of technology. The level of technological convergence is unprecedented. And then this will have consequences in the long run on technology and jobs. I mean, if you think about it, 10 years ago, YouTube videos shot during the Arab Spring became acceptable in newsrooms. They even became the norm for what we perceive as being authentic news reporting. What we're seeing today, for instance, in terms of technology is another norm, the idea of live streaming, video conferencing, with the cameras, like we're doing right now is becoming norm within mainstream media. The second aspect has to do with institutions. This was going to be the year of basically a streaming war year. It just accelerated. I mean, Apple and Disney Plus joining the race globally, BN and Shahid on the regional aspect. On so many levels, as Banu was mentioning, this notion of streaming has benefited, but sort of our quarantine-induced boredom in a sense. And it remains to be seen how many will cancel their subscription. I mean, we've seen this pattern happen before. People will subscribe just because now we need it. And then once it's over, hopefully, people will forget about it. Another area within institutions is advertising, and that will have its repercussion on media institutions generally, because COVID-19 is radically changing the outlook for sort of global economy and in many areas. Within institutions, what we're seeing and the story coming from CBS in the US and Murdoch with their Australian newspaper empire is telling. There will be, and we will be seeing a lot of restructuring in terms of media, and many are predicting that sort of the big stars, the big type of formats that we know, what we know as media, will be changing as fewer and fewer people will be involved in this, and we can talk about production later on. The third aspect is content, and this is, and I'm going to be very brief on this. Real-time TV is basically gone. Now we've developed this new habit of binge watching, and that's going to have repercussions moving forward. This has a plus side on the industry because, as we're seeing now with Netflix, is making me rediscover Egyptian and Gulf theater. In the US, people are rediscovering the Golden Girls. So it's making this old content sort of more precious in that sense. And the last point within content is this sort of explosion again and again of the do-it-yourself content, the user-generated content that's making us glued to our phones if we're not watching it on the screen.
And we'll come back to the question of content a little bit later, Joe. Coming back to you, Banu, what are some of the media frames or the media stories that we're seeing right now with the pandemic?
Okay, there are a couple of things that we're seeing in terms of the framing. Of course, one of it was, how is this, I'm going to slightly take this from a public diplomacy approach and start with, nation image building or maintenance. Because when we again look at some of the studies that have come out in this past period, people are not only seeking out information about COVID-19, but they're also following how their own government or country is dealing with this crisis. So when there is, when you have a situation when there is low trust in government officials, there is some kind of framing, especially in independent media, about how much correct information is being shared by government officials. In comparison, when there's higher trust in government officials and transparency, people are not only turning into these news outlets, these sources to receive the information, but they're also following, what the government is doing in the international arena as well. So if you are a country, that's not only able to deal, and that's how the media frames it, to deal with the crisis effectively, the next step is to see, what is the country doing as an international citizen. So we see, for example, stories emerge about I think it was a month ago, Qatar Airways, for example, is a big brand, big soft power for, for Qatar. So the fact that, Qatar Airways was having these flights to deliver medication, masks, was some of the, was a storyline that we would see. And that was not only, specific in the context of Qatar, but also we see, the news about the Cuban doctors arriving in Europe, Germany treating, Italian citizens. So there's a lot of image management into international news media. Of course, and I think we will talk about this as well, but the fact that there is, conspiracy theories and misinformation that's circulating, because, this is a global crisis. And again, we are falling for, misinformation because there's such a big knowledge gap, right? So we still don't know about the virus, and this is a perfect environment for conspiracy theories to emerge. So now when you have, for example, people and even countries, and China is a big example in this, it was found that China was actually, because again, that's sort of a government, it's a political system, to cover up failure and exaggerate success. So we saw that, for example, in Chinese media, both nationally, internationally, was circulating information about how the origins of the virus were actually coming from Russia and were orchestrated by these elite countries to kind of, again, have this anti-European image flourish. So these are some of the stories, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and some harder to verify than others as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Great, thank you for that. Joe, coming back to content production, how has content production changed in the current period?
Well, actually, for now, the changes, at least in the regional context, because there's a tendency with Ramadan productions, this is like the peak season for television production, for people to wait for the last minute to actually complete their production. And producers were caught off guard. The season was pretty much disrupted in the sense that certain shows started and were not completed. They were taken off the air because the episodes were not finished. Or because it involved a live audience, and then they would have to continue without live audience. I think the repercussions, we're not going to see it immediately. We're going to see it coming in because what is supposed to be produced now will be aired in the fall. And if we're having, if nothing is being produced right now, the challenge is what's going to happen in the fall. And when we're going to go back into to produce, what does it mean to produce safely? What's going to happen for intimate moments, crowd scenes, live action? Are they going to be written out of scripts? Are we going to move a lot of talk about moving into more experimental type of productions, coming out with narratives of small crew or inclusion of more animation? I mean, we're going to see more Avatar-like productions. Is that where we're going to go? So this is when it comes to drama. we hope that sports and talk shows and reality TV will come back much faster when we're back in. But in terms of disruption, it has been very much the case now, and this is going to have its repercussion on not only the small independent producers, but it's going to it's going to also impact the bigger ones. That's where we're there, and we're talking here about an industry, whether regionally or globally, that has been struggling because of the aforementioned battle, and because of these expedited levels of conversions that are actually taking place. You add to all these challenges a challenge now when, with this high demand, what we're seeing is more piracy taking place, because people are not willing to pay money, and there are all sorts of individuals and groups willing to actually engage in piracy, and that's also bringing in more strain to an already struggling industry. Sorry for the bleak image, but that's what it is.
Thank you for that. No, that's really interesting. And just to push you a little bit on an earlier point that you made about streaming and streaming platforms specifically to the Middle East, Joe. Are we going to see a lot more of that? We already have Middle East Netflix. You already spoke a little bit about BN.
Yeah, I mean, you have the regional ones, Wavo, BN, Cinemax, and these ones, and you also have the pirated ones, which I'm not going to publicize. So you have these aspects, but also we're expecting more competition coming in. Amazon is already competing with Netflix here. There's a lot of hype on Disney seizing the moment and actually sort of expanding into the region. They already have good footing through their products, which are well known, and what we know is that they've been engaged in discussions and also in actually hiring dubbing. So watch out for that.
Yeah,
that would be positive, maybe.
Are we finding ourselves in a situation where there is a lot more interest in user-generated content, like on TikTok, and people in their bedrooms, and not official productions, but there's actually more audiences for this kind of user-generated productions?
Absolutely. I mean, for a generation born and grown up digital, it's the new normal for them. But what we're also seeing, and this is again anecdotal, it's it's too early to actually be able to conduct research on this. But what we're noticing is that they are also tired of it, because now everybody else is doing it. So they're searching for the new thing, and we're seeing experiments taking place here and there, but. I'm not sure what would be that next big thing, but one thing is I'm confident to suggest that young people are sick and tired of the TikToks and of Snapchat and so on, because now it's like everybody else is doing it.
Well, speak to my nephews and nieces; they're all mad into TikTok. Coming back to you, Banu, can we talk just a little bit more about this term of mask diplomacy or science diplomacy, and how governments are using this to kind of fix reputations or have better reputations internationally?
Sure. So one of the things that we, as you mentioned, mask diplomacy or science diplomacy. I mean, when we look to let's say digital diplomacy in general during the COVID-19. Okay, I'm going to have to stop because my cat is meowing. I'm going to put her in another room and come back. Sorry about that. So this is a time when
is this lunchtime? Is this the cat's lunchtime? This is too good. See, it's moments like this, it's moments of disruption that are actually more interesting than everything that we prepared.
You're right.
Sorry. Well, she's so used to being on camera, right? So she's like, oh, it's my moment to shine.
Well, there you go. Everybody's a star. In the pandemic period, everyone has their 15 minutes. Sorry,
Okay.
did you want to continue with?
Yes, let's continue. So in terms of public diplomacy or digital diplomacy in the, during the COVID-19, so we saw a couple of things arise, as you mentioned, science diplomacy, mass diplomacy. But also, this is a global pandemic, obviously. So we see government officials suddenly having to turn to social media platforms or, internet technologies to offer their services not only nationally but to the diaspora that's, living outside of the country. So suddenly you see, stories emerging about how ministries are offering their services to their citizens abroad. We see stories about, again, being framed sort of who's able to bring back their citizens more efficiently back to their own country. Who is, again, another frame that we see in terms of digital diplomacy, and again, its narration in the media, who is able to acquire, for example, needed equipment from other nations, and who is providing that equipment. Again, another frame or in terms of, digital diplomacy, we see is, fostering international sort of scientific collaboration through which scientists can maybe jointly search for the vaccine, because that's also another big prestige moment, right? I mean, whoever finds the cure to this thing to be ultimately the new sort of a power. So advice on returning flights, repatriation procedures, something that we see, for example, here in the national media as well. But also another frame we see is being able to, especially from embassies or especially from ministries and embassies that we see, is the ability to kind of show solidarity with the local population. So these are some of the things that we see in terms of digital diplomacy.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
We should wrap it up in the next 10 minutes or so. But for you, Joe, what kind of alternative media are we looking at, or can we look forward to?
That's a tough question because I'm only beginning to digest what's going on. I'll just give you two highlights of what I'm finding very interesting, but on some level troubling. On the positive side, I think we're discovering certain forms of alternative forms of media that were used to be kept behind walls of copyright, or we have to pay for it, and so on. So from museums to art collectives, experimental film, video art, books, and other forms of alternative media are now available and accessible. The problem with this is the fact that this used to be paid for, and the money was used to actually help these museums, these art collectives, fund more artists in the future. And that becomes, once you have the cycle is broken on some level, particularly when it comes to the funding, that raises questions of what's going on. So what will be going on in the future? So on some level, yes, I'm happy I'm able to access them and share them and forward them to friends so that they can enjoy them. At the same time, what's going to happen later on when it comes to this? And I think the more troubling thing for me is the definition of, and I'm going to, if you don't mind me doing a little bit of theory, because, there's a moment here where everything is media and now, and it's specifically screen. So what we know of media is everything that we're doing now. We're having coffee with friends over a screen. So I don't know if we're able to distinguish now what it means to be taking a class, whether this is actually a TV show that I'm watching or actually a lesson that I'm taking. we're exercising on screens, we're meditating on screens. So, within this picture, this blurring of what we see and how the world now is mediated to us, and this is our only connection. I think, researchers will be looking at this in terms of the kind of alternative to what we know as being media in the future, and what this would entail on so many levels, interpersonal communication, but also mass communication, and what we know between alternative and mainstream, which is increasingly blurring, because now, for instance, you're seeing stars invading Instagram and occupying it, and acting like Instagram stars. So these types of blurring are exciting moments, but also very, very troubling, because it makes us anxious. It's an uncharted territory.
Exactly. And maybe this is just a question that's open, whoever would like to answer it, but this current period has really put a sharp focus on the question of access and the question of those who have access to media, and the differences between, different socioeconomic groups, and for those who are unable to live the lives that we are currently living online, and, meeting friends online and so on, what does it mean for them, and what can be done about it?
Can I just take a few minutes, and then Joe, I'll just hand it over to you. This is actually, previously I said it was a global pandemic. Yes, it is global, but not every social class has been hit by it in a similar manner. Disadvantaged populations have become much more disadvantaged because not only of the virus, but also all the social, cultural, economical issues that are related with it. I'll give you an example from my home country, Turkey. Just like Qatar, Turkey was very quick to move to online education for both elementary schools and for K-12 schools and universities. But it was quickly discovered that this model was not sustainable. It was not sustainable because, again, this is a country where there are, structural differences, economic, class structure. The western part of the country, in comparison to the eastern part of the country, is much more developed economically and with technology infrastructure as well. So they found out that, in the eastern parts of Turkey, especially in particular cities, there was absolutely no way to have online communication, because not only do the students have access to that technology, even the teachers don't have access to that technology and don't have the necessary skills and knowledge to be able to deliver. And this is something that we had actually should have seen before. Because there were, when schools were moving to integrating technology, one laptop per child kind of a technology, it was quickly seen that if you come from a socioeconomic family that does not have access to this technology, it doesn't even, there is no benefit of handing that laptop to that child, because they don't have connection at home, don't have a family member who is savvy or knows about the technology that can actually help that child navigate. So these are some of the things, in terms of access. Joe, what would you like to add?
Totally agree with you. I totally agree with you. The notion of divides we've noticed crystallized before our eyes, and they're deep and they're systemic. And they're not just a divide in terms of the access level, but in terms of literacies. The ability to navigate this, we've seen that not only, as Banu was saying, not only on a socioeconomic level, but also in terms of age. Older generations are left behind from this, and particularly that ability to adapt to this level of technology. But at the same time, we've seen, at least within the region, we've seen that the kind of leapfrogging that happened in terms of more access to mobile has generated a lot. And I'll, maybe it's a good way of ending this with a personal note. My mother, for the longest time, refused a smartphone. But once she found herself being alone in the house, we had to do it remotely, trying to teach her a smartphone remotely, because that was the only way where she could have access to her grandchildren, she could have access to us. And now we can't stop her. I mean, she's, my phone is buzzing. So there are processes, but again, I mean, she's not, she's not on the lower socioeconomic level. Again, so these divides are deep and systemic.
Thank you so much, Banu. Thank you, Joe, for being with us today and for sharing your insights your insights in media and the current pandemic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome.